Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? I had the microphone out of position today. We are back down in the downstairs studio. No more refrigerator repair work going on at the moment, so we can move into here quietly. We are minus one of the kids who was off at scout camp this week. Almost succeeded in getting both of them to go to scout camp this time around, but didn't quite work out in the way. Well, we weren't expecting both to be gone, but we had an opportunity to send our second son, but he was having none of it on short notice, so he's here to interrupt the proceedings at some point. I think he's probably still asleep. We got teenagers in the house now, and we'll ignore all of that and move ahead with the show. You probably won't notice it much different. There being much difference between the school year and summer at this point, but you might notice that there's a difference between having a competent president and a lunatic in the White House. That's possible. That may have come up at some point during the weekend. Lots to catch up on, of course, and it will be good to have Greg back with us to help us get our footing for the week. I see lots of stories coming through now, so I know it's going to be a day chock full of facts and maybe a little bit of revealing fiction as well. The president didn't tweet much over the weekend. I don't think. There was, of course, there was definitely some. No doubt about that. Well, let's see if we can catch up. I saw some news. I didn't really follow Trump that closely over the weekend, which was kind of a nice thing to do. And, of course, it was Father's Day weekend. How was your Father's Day, everybody? I had a nice one. Though we did send one of the kids off to camp, and that's kind of a sad thing. But, they play the U.S. Open for all the dads and whatnot over the Father's Day weekend. And I understand some other people who aren't even fathers enjoy it, too. This is one of a few weekends during the summer during which time, for whatever reason, we are reminded that the golfing crowd pronounces the word amateur as amateur. I don't really know why that is, but I don't know. Is that a high-class affectation we should all sort of take on? Is it solely golf? Not really sure exactly what that comes from. Oh, let's see. Check out the tweet. Is there a tweet? Greg's just sent along with those raft of stories. I'm directed to check out a tweet. Remembering Dad on Father's Day. This was the 50s. This is Greg's tweet. Javits wouldn't cross a picket line for the news shows without permission. Wow. That is old-timey. And photo of the newspapers of the day. And I guess they did let him through. The picket, he asked permission of the labor unions that were picketing outside the NBC studios, and they decided to let him through. Little photo here, and we'll have Greg tell us a little bit about that. He's got more background on that one. You don't see that happening very often anymore. Let's see. Other things that we were catching up on over the weekend. Let's see. I don't know where we can start. There was, of course, I say of course, even though just sort of a slow developing news story. Let me bring Greg in here so we can all get our footing together. Good morning, Greg.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Okay.
How's my signal?
It's pretty good. Is there a question about it today, or just?
I don't know. It's just one of those things that radio people ask,
Yeah, sure.
At least I pretend that radio people ask. I wouldn't know.
Right. We're like 5 or 6 by another 5 to 7 or so, I think, is what they usually say. I think they have terminology for that. Yes.
I suppose.
They would say 5 by 5, and then, and Justice has said it now, and he even explained it to us once, and I looked it up in Wikipedia about why, but then I was distracted by an insane president.
It happens.
Yeah.
So this tweet that I sent was on Father's Day, and it is indeed. It's from the old New York Herald Tribune.
Well.
Paper. It doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And it's a picture of Jacob Javits being escorted by a union official through a picket line. The picket line broke to let him through, negotiated with the union, because he needed to do some news shows, but he refused to cross a picket line without permission.
Man.
So one of the union officials escorted him through the picket line, which is something that I remember growing up pretty much my entire life. That union official that was escorting Senator Javits through was my father.
Oh, well.
And I always remember, whenever there was a picket line about a little thing, there was a little store or whatever, it's just, I was raised to understand that it was absolutely verboten to cross it. You just didn't do it. You didn't even think about doing it.
Yeah, well, that's long gone.
Right.
Certainly,
so in the background, because it's right in front of 30
too.
Rock, it looks exactly the same then as it does now. Art Deco, kind of marquee on top.
Yes.
And you can see on the street, if you look at the picture, there's some cars parked on the other side. And the fins on the back of that car are sharp enough to cut your finger. So I sent it around the internet yesterday and said, car aficionados, help me with this. What year is this? And the year they came up with was 58, 59. Probably a Studebaker, could have been a DeSoto, because they couldn't see the front of the car, just the back. Javits was in the way. But the fins are like really big and really sharp.
Yeah. Well, what did they
So it was
do
a fun
for
picture.
Car back in then?
I thought that was a good way to recognize Father's Day.
Yeah, I think that's very nice. Yeah, you hadn't said in the tweet that it was your dad. That's nice.
Well, if you click on the picture, it's outlined.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. There, I see now. It's circled. Yeah,
in red. So like even
bigger
I could find
picture
it.
somehow. I don't know. It looks like it focuses in on the photo on Twitter. So I just
yeah. No, you got to click to see the whole thing. So I sent the picture along with it too.
Okay.
Anyway, but the wording on it is, officials of the National Association of Broadcast Employees and Technicians, it's NABET, yesterday escorted Senator Jacob J. Javits R., New York. Remember, there were liberal Republicans in the Northeast in those days, across their picket line at the National Broadcasting Company so he could appear on the WRCA TV program Direct Line. We call it NBC now. But RCA, Radio Corporation of America, was it wasn't Comcast, it was RCA that owned NBC.
Yeah.
And a lot of the stuff was named RCA. They made tubes.
Yeah, the things you float on in the water.
No, these electric tubes that you would stick in the back of TVs, and there were like 50 different kinds, and you had to have the right one, and part of being a television repairman in those days is having a whole set of glass tubes that you could plug in to get exactly the right one when it burned out.
The vacuum tubes, of course, have been replaced by Roomba tubes.
Exactly. The NABET union is engaged in the labor dispute with NBC and has picketed its studios at 30 Rockefeller Plaza since last Monday. Union officials agreed to withdraw the picket line briefly after Senator Javits told them he would not cross it. So there's a Republican refusing to cross a picket line. Those were the days.
And union officials who said, we should do something differently because the local Republican is threatening not to go on radio and television if we don't.
Because he's honoring what we're doing, so we can negotiate with him because he generally supports unions.
Because he's reasonable and wants to talk to people about what they're doing and what their grievances are, and can we work something out as opposed to...
So it was pretty cool. Anyway, but it was Father's Day, so I thought I would do that.
That is a great Father's Day share. That was yesterday. This is today. What have you done for me lately, Greg?
Today today is the day after the Megyn Kelly, Alex Jones interview, and a lot on that. So all of last week, once Megyn Kelly announced that is what she was doing, there was all sorts of feedback and pushback and upsetness, and particularly in Newtown, Nelba Marquez Green, who's one of the moms of one of the children who was shot at Sandy Hook, had a op-ed in the Washington Post. My daughter died at Sandy Hook. Megyn Kelly's interview with Alex Jones is an insult, and it's just a terrific piece. But while she's writing this, she also wants to make sure that it's a Father's Day thing as well. She writes, there's a special insult in Jones' segment being aired on Kelly's program on Father's Day. The grief of fathers is often ignored. In Newtown and across the country, bereaved fathers often grieve the loss of their loved ones without any support. On a weekend that honors dads, showcasing Jones, a man who's denied that our children were murdered, shows a breathtaking lack of sensitivity. And she talks about how Kelly was trying to shine a light, but that doesn't work. And she's made the point in interviews All Things Considered on NPR in this piece that it's not unusual for people writing about Newtown to want reaction to always focus on the moms and completely ignore the dads. And it's an example, she says, of the kind of lack of support and support structures that often exist for the men. And just don't forget them, especially on Father's Day. So I thought that was particularly good.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting. It's still the standard kind of reaction shot that the news is used to carrying, and it's not that it's an odd.
Well, mamas are supposed to grieve. They're supposed to cry. Dads are supposed to sit there in the background and take it and be quiet and be rocks, and be the foundation and not say anything. And that's a very difficult role.
It's very weird. And the other role that is available to you by traditional gender roles, which is also not one you want to foster, is, the dad will go out and lash out at somebody violently as a result instead, as opposed to, this is the real world, and there's nothing we can do to bring our children back, and why don't you talk to me?
Right. So, LOL GOP says, it's a truther who's famous for telling the families of murdered kids are liars is getting more press than a plot to uninsure 23 million people.
True also.
Which is also true. Neil Scoville writes, Megyn Kelly didn't get played by Alex Jones. NBC got played by Megyn Kelly. And I have this really nice piece by Matthew Gertz, who's a media critic for Media Matters, talk about what actually happened on the show, which did air last night. And basically what happened is that he's got a series of tweets and a story about it, which I sent to you, but the tweets kind of cover it. After immense public outcry, the Jones interview was downplayed and the surrounding segment was well edited to inform and make him look bad. Andy Lack, the president of NBC, by reports in the media, in Variety and Page 6, you can find these reports, that they were having emergency meetings all week, completely re-edited the show. And the unalloyed good news is that criticism from the Sandy Hook families, Matthew Gertz says, and others forced Kelly to respond accordingly. The bad news is that NBC and Kelly had no idea how to handle a public war with Jones. He owned the narrative and turned it to his benefit. He's talking about the back and forth that happened all week.
Yeah.
Interviews with conspiracy theorists are tough and risk giving a platform, but segment largely left it on the cutting room floor after complaints. So basically, instead of having an hour-long sweetie pie fest with Alex Jones, and I didn't watch it. I refused to watch it, so I'm getting this from the people who did. So apparently that interview was sliced and diced and cut to pieces, and most of it didn't show up and wound up, in fact, in the end, making him look bad, a much better piece of journalism, and that was because people pushed back. And so I think that, for people to look at it and say, hey, listen, it wasn't that bad. I saw it, all that storm and drag about nothing. It's like Y2K. If you go ahead and make the arrangements to make sure nothing happens and then nothing happens, it isn't because it was a waste of effort. It was because you took steps so things were okay.
Yeah, interesting. There was a lot of pushback from both sides. There was a lot of pushing and shoving all week. And, part of it, probably the decision at NBC, in addition to trying to put together a decent piece of journalism in the face of this outrage.
When they weren't going to before. That's really the thing to emphasize.
Right. And, the other element going on here was that, for whatever reason, Alex Jones spent the week releasing his own surreptitiously produced tape of the interview, and now I'm sure he feels justified. They sliced and diced and edited this thing into something it wasn't when we actually sat down face to face, which is also kind of telling. And I guess in a way, I'm a little bit glad that he actually did that, because now we can think about what does it mean that without this pressure, this was going to be a totally different piece, and we can get some sense of what it might have been like.
Yeah, in fact, Megyn Kelly told Alex Jones, because these tapes are available, that there's going to be a softball piece, basically, and I'm really not going to go out to get you. I just, I've been fascinated by you ever since I learned about you, and I want to show all the sides.
Great. Yeah, so...
There was also a unshown Putin question.
Yeah.
From her Putin interview that was floating around that somebody got a hold of and said, basically, it was cut and it wasn't shown in the original piece, which was bad enough. And the question was along the lines of, you're a mass murderer and everybody hates you. How do you deal with the pressure?
Yeah, how come you're so awesome?
How come you're so awesome despite all of that?
Yeah,
which gives you an idea of what she would have done without any of the pressure that was placed on her by people, who were working to ratchet it up.
Yeah, And the worst part is that his conspiracy theorist fans will now look at this and say, you're absolutely right. The end product on NBC really was nothing like the natural interview that you taped, and the media is out to get you.
Good.
So, fantastic.
So that was a win.
Yep.
But again, it was only done because of the pushback. Now, why was it an issue in the first place? Jay Rosen has a short tweet storm which illustrates the issue, I think. And I have to put this in the perspective of having this discussion prior to the interview being shown with a lot of the media people that I follow and follow me on Twitter. Mm-hmm. And you have the reasonable people who said this is ridiculous and heartless and really should never have been shown. And then you have the purists who say, oh, well, absolutely you should do an interview like this because it's journalism and you have to. And, of course, that makes a huge assumption, and that is that Megyn Kelly's a journalist. So, it's like when you see the news media personalities circle the wagons around Fox News and say, stop picking on them because, they're another outlet that hires us. So don't go too hard on them. And in fact, it was quite interesting because the reporters who were trying to make the case that you have to shine a light on it really got pretty slammed by a lot of their fellow journalists. And then Jay Rosen wrote this piece, which I thought was very clarifying. He says, on the eve of Megyn Kelly's risky interview with Alex Jones, I offer in this thread a fable. Oh. I like stories.
Everyone likes fables.
Sometimes stories tell themselves, and this is one of those. It's titled, The Abyss of Observation Alone. By a fable, I mean a story, the outstanding feature of which is a compressed insight. This did not happen. It's not factual. It's a fiction. What he's about to tell he means.
Okay.
Reporters in conflict zones call it going out, leaving the safety of the base, the city, the hotel, in order to observe for yourself. So our fable is set in Sarajevo during the siege from 1992 to 1995, the longest in modern history, where more than 10,000 people were killed.
Okay.
For contacts, a Western reporter in Sarajevo gets an invitation. Visit with Bosnian Serb snipers and hear their side of the story.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
All right.
Doesn't sound good so far. All right.
Doesn't sound good, right? After weighing the dangers and deciding how much he trusts the intermediary, the reporter decides to go. And the rendezvous is arranged. He's picked up, blindfolded, moved from one car to another, taken into the hills above the city, which is where the siege happens. Mm-hmm. At the encampment where the last car deposits him, he's introduced to the man who shoot innocent people in the streets below. Remember, this is a fable.
Okay. All right. Then I feel better.
One of the snipers mentions to the reporter to come look through his rifle scope and see what they see. As part of his story, you could, give some background there. This is why he's there, to observe. So the reporter leans down, peers through the scope, and sees two civilians idling on a corner, unaware that they're within range. And then the sniper says to the journalist, which one? The one on the left or the one on the right? Okay. Stunned by the question, declining to answer, the reporters pull back from the lens. I didn't come here to be part of what you do. Sniper laughs. 2 quick shots, he kills them both. And it says, you should have answered. You could have saved one.
Oh, okay.
Now turn to Megyn Kelly. Remember, it's a fable. But it could have happened. So now turn to Megyn Kelly, thinking she's going to stare into the abyss of Alex Jones and return with a great story to kick off her show. In her mind, Kelly's going out, leaving the safety of the studio to see for herself. Conspiracy Theory America, take a look. Surely she's not joining up with Alex Jones, but it doesn't occur to her that Jones can join her to his cause without her consent. Just like in his story. Megyn Kelly may well end up fortifying Jones with his core supporters and helping to spread his brand of media hate to more people. Still, I wouldn't say something like it's forbidden to interview him. Rather, it's stupid to do so with an innocent intention. And that's how the show started. That was the original premise. That's what got put on the cutting floor. That's what pressure changed. That's me adding all of that. So the lesson is just because you say you're there only to observe doesn't mean you have the power to confine yourself to an observer's role. And that's what my fable's about. You may think you're there to get a story. The story may have other plans. So you really have to be incredibly stupid and naive to think that you're going to go interview Alex Jones, tell everybody about it weeks in advance, think he's going to do nothing about it as his end.
Yes.
And that you're not going to get sucked into the whole thing.
She may be that.
And so basically NBC had to save her and rescue her from her folly. And in doing so, diminishes her, however the show came out.
Well, you can anticipate having to do that with cub reporters at their first job. Sometimes there's development work that has to be done. How are they supposed to know that she couldn't handle this?
So I thought that was, like a major event and one of the things that we should talk about today.
Yes.
Okay, well, here's another. So it turns out that the U.S. shot down a Syrian plane.
Yeah, that's true, too.
In Syria.
Mm-hmm.
Not in Ohio or Idaho or anything like that. In Syria. So now there's this Reuters piece out this morning I just saw. Russia to target any flying objects over Syria where its aviation is active.
That's a broad mandate.
And basically, Russia's threatening to shoot down U.S. planes.
Without saying any flying object. What about Putin's rearing head? Does that matter?
What about, Trump's bombast? That kind of goes up there along with the hot air. See, the point of all of that is that we are that much closer to getting into a shooting war with Russia because Trump doesn't know what the hell he's doing.
That is, it's hard to believe that could happen given that he warned that Hillary Clinton would get us into a shooting war in Syria.
Right. Can you imagine? And then, what does he do? He's going to turn and say, Mattis, you handle it.
Yes,
right.
Mad
Dog, go do what you do, right? Leave me alone. I'm going to watch TV. I'm going to watch Fox.
Right.
And I'm going to yell at everybody about the Russia investigation.
Yes. Please don't look into anything having to do with Russia. Russia is our friend. We're shooting at them in Syria.
I mean, for those who didn't really think it mattered who was president, because both parties are the same, right?
Mm-hmm. There's not a dime's worth of difference between
Not a dime's worth, And then we have this huge healthcare thing, which is 2 weeks away from McConnell bringing it to a vote. McConnell has said over and over and over that he wants to bring this to a vote before July 4th.
Yes, because independence.
But the intriguing thing is that he may not have 50 votes to pass this monstrosity. It's got to be scored by the CBO before a lot of the senators will vote on it. They're not like the House. And it may be that the CBO gives it a bad score and it may not pass. And there remains speculation, not that McConnell is managing to push everybody together and get this through, which may in fact happen. But there's also speculation that remains and has not disappeared. That McConnell wants this to go for a vote even if he loses, because he just wants it off the table.
Well, it certainly occupied all of his time for the past month. I'm sure he would like it gone.
Yeah, but then, see, if you just leave it and say, let's do it in July or August or September, it never goes away. If you bring it to a vote and lose, then you're done.
Yes.
There's no Tom MacArthur amendment to bring it back from the dead and make it a zombie healthcare bill.
Yes, usually. If they want to take some sort of extraordinary...
not because it can't be done procedurally, because that's McConnell's stance.
Yeah, okay. Well, he can change that, certainly.
He could, but he'd have to have the votes to do it. Otherwise, what's the point?
I don't know. I don't know what the point of doing it this time is, but they are doing it.
He's got to get it off of, otherwise everybody's going to be completely consumed with this. How does that work? Tomorrow, we have a special election in Georgia. Very close election. Razor sharp, razor thin distance between the two candidates. And John Ossoff, the Democrat, who shouldn't be competitive, is very competitive. And he's competitive because he's making healthcare an issue. Mm-hmm. Now, if he winds up winning that race tomorrow,
yes,
having made healthcare the central issue of his campaign, that's going to change McConnell's calculus.
Yes, perhaps.
Because, not necessarily because he's already decided to bring it to a vote regardless.
Right.
But other senators may look at it and say, I'm not voting for this. And in fact, the procedural part of it is the need for reconciliation to make sure that whatever's in the Senate bill doesn't cost any more than what's in the House bill. And the House bill's pretty bad and pretty draconian.
Yeah.
Which makes it hard for some of the senators to vote for it. We get the idea that, Susan Collins is troubled and she'll vote for it anyway. And we get the idea that Murkowski is troubled, but she's got a big constituency in Alaska to account for. And same with Collins in Maine. So, all the calls and all the pressure to continue to call your senators if you're from the states that matter, Dean Heller's state and Susan Collins' state and Lisa Murkowski's state. And if you don't live there, if you know people who do live there, call them and tell them to call. All of that matters. But I think that what matters more than anything else is the results of tomorrow's election.
Well, they certainly could weigh heavily, which explains there were some desperate measures taken over the weekend. I understand both candidates have come out to condemn a third-party expenditure. Just happens, of course, to benefit Karen Handel, the Republican. But the third-party group came out with an ad essentially trying to lay the Washington congressional baseball practice shooting at John Ossoff's feet. So
Sure.
We'll see whether that catches fire in the few hours that they were able to run it.
The best piece that I've seen so far, and there's been a lot of them, on what's going on in Georgia comes from Jonathan Martin and Alexander Burns. Alex Burns is one of my favorite New York Times political reporters. And here we go. There's that piece. Okay. High-stakes referendum on Trump takes shape in a Georgia special election. I want to just go through that a little bit because I really think it sets the table pretty well. There's two Trump cabinet secretaries, Mark Price, who's currently HHS, and Sonny Perdue, former Georgia governor, who happens to be the agriculture secretary right now. Two Trump cabinet secretaries, both Georgia Republicans, had unwittingly revealed the twin hurdles standing in Ms. Handel's path heading into Tuesday election. Democratic enthusiasm is soaring across the country, while the sort of pastel and polo-clad Republicans who reside in the district are uneasy about what they see in Washington and have decidedly mixed views of President Trump. Republicans, weighed down by Mr. Trump's growing unpopularity, must demonstrate that they can separate themselves from the president enough to hold suburban districts that only now are becoming battlegrounds. And Democrats, facing a restive base hungry for victory after disappointing losses in Montana and Kansas, folks, you shouldn't have been disappointed. Those are ruby red places, and it's great we did as well as we did, are under pressure to show they can notch something more than a moral victory in the sort of affluent seat they will need in order to take back the House majority. An outright win in Georgia would serve as a validation of the party's overall strategy. Democrats have been recruiting aggressively in Republican-leaning seats, including Michigan, Illinois, and New Jersey, and party officials expect a wave of new challengers to announce their candidacies after the start of the next fundraising quarter in July. But the stakes are highest for Republicans, who have held the district since the Carter administration without much of a challenge to speak of. And if they lose, well, it's a race we have to win, said State Senator Brandon Beach, a Republican whose district includes part of the terrain being fought here. Republican officials worry if Mr. Ossoff wins, it would send a resounding statement about the intensity of the backlash to Mr. Trump, prompting incumbents to think twice about running for re-election, slowing fundraising, and most significantly, further imperiling their already stalemated legislative agenda. It's not just symbolic. We can't afford to lose any seats at this point, said Representative Tom Rooney, Republican of Florida, noting that the factions among congressional Republicans make the majorities more tenuous in practice than they may seem on paper. So that's the idea there. That's why I'm saying that if Ossoff wins, huge blow to McConnell trying to get health care passed in Washington. So you can call your senators, but if you live in the district, you can do even better than calling your senators. You can elect John Ossoff.
Okay. I don't, but let's find people who do. If you're listening, of course. But
certainly getting lots of play and lots of attention.
Yeah, and I'll be glad to have this one done for sure as well. There were a couple moments there where I wish they had, if the election had been held that day, things might have been much more solid. I don't know, but we'll see how this goes. This is a real close one, of course, and I don't even know whether the election day voting is going to be what swings this thing. The huge numbers of people voting early in this, and Republicans in Georgia sort of scrambling at the last minute to and thinking about whether or not their voter suppression efforts have been strong enough. I guess not. So,
well, so here's
anyway.
Robert Costa talking about
I forgot all about Sonny
Georgia.
Perdue, though. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a nice segue into the next part of it. The stakes have stoked. Stakes have stoked. I like that.
Is that right?
Stoking stakes.
Okay.
Stoking stakes have talked of unity among wings of the Democratic Party, which has dealt with inter-party tensions since Trump won. On Sunday, Bernie Sanders said he was standing with Ossoff, even though Ossoff has not run as a vocal progressive. Absolutely, Sanders said, I very much want Ossoff to win. His views are a lot better than his Republican opponents. Sanders also said Democrats should do everything possible to counter Trump and his Republican health care bill, and framed the Georgia race as one of the ways the party could begin to turn around its fortune. Costa then goes on to say, Senate Democratic leaders are considering several maneuvers to stop Republicans from proceeding on the legislation and to protest the GOP's behind-the-scenes discussion. According to aides, one senator's return to Washington on Monday, that's today, Democrats may threaten to halt procedural routines and boycott committee meetings and hearings. That's in addition to sternly worded letters.
Yes.
Senate Republicans have acknowledged the potential political pitfalls should the legislation be defined by the secrecy in which it has been deliberated. Senate's not a place you can just cook up something behind closed doors and rush it for a vote on the floor, said, you want to guess who? Marco Rubio.
Oh.
Every camera in the world is going to have to see what's in it. And so the point is, again, in a procedural sense, with McConnell having the gavel, there's really nothing the Democrats can do to stop it. Yeah. But what they can do is by slowing it, bring attention to it, and then having something to put on the news. One of the problems with not having hearings and not having an actual bill in your hand is it's very difficult for Democrats to keep going in front of TV cameras and saying, I want you to concentrate your cameras on this nothing that's not happening.
Yes. Although this was a great opportunity.
Producers say, well, that's boring. Let's do a Trump rally.
Yeah. Well, it was a great opportunity to get up on and say there were death panels in it or something like that and say, look, I don't know if they're in there or not, neither do you, and they won't tell us. How do you know it's not in there? Because it's a secret.
But even better is a sit-in or some procedure that gets Republicans yelling at Democrats that you can put on the news. And it doesn't change the ability of McConnell to guide this through if, in fact, that's what he intends to do. He can always change rules. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it gets you on TV and it makes a big deal out of it. And so, there's a time and a place for it. It looks like this week is that time and that place.
Yeah. The past couple of days, the end of last week, a lot of this sort of comes up every time there's an opportunity to do something like this. And some senators say, yes, we should be doing that. And some senators say, well, we should be taking a more cautious approach for these reasons. And then depending on which faction you are with, as a Democrat, you amplify one message or the other. And so last week was a lot of amplification of the senators who thought that maybe this wasn't going to be strategically helpful. And so lots of grousing about if the Democrats aren't even going to do this, they should be abandoned as a party, and we should never support Democrats ever again, and we need to burn it down and start over. And, of course, reminder that there are some Democrats who are saying perhaps we should ponder this strategy, and others who are saying perhaps we should ponder a different one. We don't know what the strategy is yet. There will be, but I think still, I hope that they come down in what I'll call the right place, because even people who are willing to give them more leeway at this moment really want to have a visible and
yes, a visible presence and a visible voice that says this is not a good idea. You're doing it over our objections. We're going to do everything we possibly can. Yeah. And this goes back to something I've said for a long time about Donald Trump. There was a huge study and survey by the Washington Post and Kaiser Family Foundation combined that was in this weekend's Washington Post about rural voters.
Oh, yes.
And who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that what Trump is doing, of course, with his tweets and with his actions, is completely playing to his own base and nobody else. Dan Balls has one piece in the Washington Post. Rural America lifted Trump to the presidency, support is strong but not monolithic. And what I wrote about it is my working thesis is that I like and support Trump, say they, because even though he's a jerk, he's wrong, and he's embarrassing, he fights for our tribe when no one else will. And that's why any given mistake, from Russia entanglement, shooting down planes in Syria and getting involved with them, to being a grifter, emoluments, whatever, it won't matter. Who else fights for us, the rural America, who can see small town life is good, Every fight he has is a fight for us. So it may not be overt racism and antipathy for people of color, for all of them. It certainly is for a lot of them. But the end result looks exactly the same because the white evangelical base wants Christian America, rural people don't like the cities. Trump is seen as fighting for all of them. It excludes people who aren't part of them and who don't look like them. And the reason that they stick with Trump, this core base, is because he looks to be fighting for them. So what do Democrats want? Democrats and activists want our Democratic senators and people in Washington fighting for us. How do you do that? Well, if you don't do it on healthcare, what the hell are you going to do it on?
Yeah. Well, that's true. Of course, it helps if people aren't confused about what they would like people to fight for or which side.
But that's the point. It doesn't matter. Just like with the Trump people, it doesn't matter what he does as long as he's seen as fighting.
I guess there's something to that.
There is something to that. And so what activists want to see is Democrats do something and not just sit around and ponder how they might do something about it 3.5 months from now when it doesn't matter.
Yes. In particular, I thought all of the justifications for doing something other than fighting with everything they had were particularly awful.
Exactly. So if there's no other alternative, and this is fine, this is democracy in action. If it turns out that the activist base pushes cautious leaders in Washington who by the nature of what they do are much more concerned about re-election than the activists are. And because of that, push them to do something, maybe not as much as the activist wants, but more than what the cautious politicians would have done without the activists. That's a win.
Yeah. You can't count that as well. They're leading from behind. It's true. You're right. I mean, you can count it that way.
Good.
You just don't count it.
That's fine. They're there to tamp down exuberant, irrational exuberance about things that can't be done. It's not like we're going to impeach Trump tomorrow. They keep reminding us it doesn't work that way. This is something that has to ripen. They don't have the votes, and so don't ask for it. Or if you ask for it, understand that you're not getting it. And that's fine. That's their job. And our job is to say, okay, but here are the things that he ought to be impeached over.
Right.
I mean, it's pretty simple, and it's not, everybody going at each other's necks over it. It's a healthy dynamic, and there's nothing wrong with seeing it played out.
And it happens all the time.
And it happens all the time.
Still, we'll get into some of the procedural discussion at some point, probably later on, maybe later today, but certainly later this week, and discuss the odds of various things, quote unquote, working. What can you look for? What does having your strategy work really mean?
Yeah, what's it look like in real life? And in fact, what is that strategy?
I don't know yet. Well, I'm telling them what it should be, but yeah, lots of pushback, for instance, on the idea of grinding business to a halt.
That's one of the more common ones. That's worthy of coverage so people understand what the deal is there.
And there are different ways to do that and different definitions for what grinding things to a halt really means. And some senators willing to go this far but not that far, others wanting to do one but the other one but not the first, and we'll explain what some of those options are. But remember that this is coming to the floor under reconciliation, and ultimately it means it does come to a vote at some point, and we're likely to lose that vote. Now, I say I don't care whether we lose it or not necessarily. If it can't be prevented, it can't be prevented. But to me, there's a big difference in losing that vote quietly next week versus losing it after 2 weeks of intense pitched battle later on. I mean, even if the numbers end up being the same, I need to see damage done to the people who are taking the position of passing this thing. People need to be raked over the coals. You can't just point and say, "There's coals. Could have raked you."
Yes, right there in my sternly worded letter.
Right. So, not going to work. And I actually saw floated at some point somebody, anonymously, thank God, because you'd be kicked in the butt if you said it with your name attached to it. The idea that, if we really go all out in fighting against this healthcare bill, not only does it eventually get passed because it's being brought to the floor under reconciliation, but we might not get their continued cooperation on the Russia probes. And we're doing so well with those on the Senate side. You're not getting any when the chips are down, you will get zero cooperation. And if you think you can point to, well, I didn't object very strongly to your horrible health care bill, I'll just say, that's your problem. So what? I don't care that you did that. I was never going to give you credit for that, no matter what you did. Doesn't matter.
So, I think that's basically my summary for today. Now that I've gotten you thinking about all that stuff, I think you got material for the show.
I guess so. I do have to hit a couple extra news points that happened over the weekend, including somehow the collision with a container ship and a U.S. Navy vessel that killed 7 sailors.
Sailors, yeah. They drowned trying to make sure that the ship didn't sink.
Well, good job. It didn't. So, yeah. I mean, amazing story. I opened up.
I don't understand how it happened in the first place.
Me neither. And I had to open. If you have to open one story, I guess, well, you, like me, would have probably clicked on the one that says, how could the Navy destroyer collision happen? Because I think, if you've seen a Navy destroyer, by the way, it's covered in radar.
Yeah, I mean, they can knock missiles down.
I mean, yeah, they see everything.
How did they not see this ship?
Yeah, so I would like to know about that. And it's just another story. I think I'll be fascinated by it because it's another one of those things that's like, you know what? Stuff is really complicated. And if everything goes wrong, even dumb stuff like this can happen. This is the sort of thing that you just figure that, 2 gigantic boats. I see you see me. Maybe I turn like in the shopping aisles, I went this way and he went, and then I went the other, but I've never, rammed my shopping cart through somebody else and injured or killed them either. So, but okay, the ships are bigger. How does it happen? We'll take a look at that. And then the side story of that, from that one, which was that the news broke about that and Donald Trump couldn't stop tweeting about his polls.
Right. So I'll leave you with that. This is Greg Dworkin speaking with my friend David Waldman Kagro in the morning. Thanks so much for listening, folks. I'll be back on Wednesday. David will be back tomorrow, as far as I know.
Yes.
And we'll do it again.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Greg.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Let's take a look at that one. I am fascinated by that one and amazed at all aspects of this story and just, I don't know. I have no answers and I didn't really get very much fed to me over the weekend on it, and I didn't seek it out either. I kind of decompressed a little bit over the weekend, but NPR happens to have this story in print, even though they're radio. You know how that works on the internet. Philip Ewing wrote this up. How could the Navy destroyer collision happen? I would like to know. The headline shocked the close-knit world of the surface Navy, and really it shocked everybody else as well. 7 sailors aboard the destroyer USS Fitzgerald were killed and other crew members injured when the warship collided with a cargo vessel off Japan. And I guess it's not I guess you should expect some losses in the collision of 2 gigantic ships, but also you wonder about, they don't approach at light speed, you know what I mean? But you gotta stand your ground on a Navy ship. Everybody has a station to stay at, and that's how you prevent things from like the total loss of the ship. People actually gave their lives at their duty stations, I guess. And also, who knows? I mean, you're even when you're not on duty on a Navy ship, you're somewhere where you're being distracted by something. Who knows if you have any idea what's going on out on the surface, even if you're, off duty at the time. You may be asleep. Let me take a look at this story. As the Navy family grieves, both it and the wider world are asking the same question: how did this happen? The short answer is that no one knows yet. The official inquiries into what led up to the encounter could take months or more, which is another one of those things that you wonder about. 2 giant ships on the ocean. What's a months-long inquiry into that? But stuff's complicated, man. The Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard both likely will eventually issue reports that describe what happened and could make recommendations for preventing another such accident. That's another interesting involvement there. The U.S. Coast Guard involved in it, despite the fact that it's off the coast. It is off a coast, that's true, but it was Japan's coast. All right. I will not speculate on how long these investigations will last, said Vice Admiral Joseph O'Coin, commander of the Navy's 7th Fleet. The Fitzgerald and other ships of Destroyer Squadron 15, based outside Tokyo, fall under his authority. There are clues, however, that explain how something like the Fitzgerald's collision could happen, including the photographs of the ships involved, navigation data about the container ship ACX Crystal, and the experience the Navy has had with past mishaps. The $1.8 billion Fitzgerald is one of the most modern and technologically advanced warships afloat, capable of using its powerful sensors to look up into space, if necessary, and reach up to hit targets there with its battery of missiles. It was the down problem, I guess, that they had. This is crazy. The destroyer still has a human crew, however. I mean, what do they, I don't even understand. Like, in what sense? There's people on the boat. Yeah, of course, that's the way boats work. Or are we saying the crew is human and they can make mistakes? The destroyer still has a human crew, however, most of which was likely asleep. At around 2:30 a.m. local time when it collided with the Crystal. That won't help, but still, I'm sure there are people awake and, people awake and looking out like, hey, large boat, I'm steering the ship. So I'll steer away from this other one. There was no moon over the waters south of Tokyo Bay. And this is the most amazing thing about it. Like, if you ever read any of the write-ups of how the Titanic disaster happened, of course, one thing, people being overconfident in the so-called unsinkability of the ship. But, it's just all the stupid things that combine to make it, the worst possible scenario. So no moon, so no light out there. That would have helped, I'm sure. No moon over the water south of Tokyo Bay, according to local accounts, and the channel there is frequently crowded with ships on their way into and out of the Japanese capital. I would imagine that's probably true. Vessels of all sizes sail to other ports in Asia or head east into the vast Pacific. Sailors in the Fitzgerald's Combat Information Center and on its bridge are responsible for using the ship's sensors to plot the location of each one, as well as the directions they're headed and the speed at which they're sailing. Officers and sailors must at all times keep what the Navy calls good situational awareness about not only what their own ship is doing, but about what might be ahead in the next patch of ocean where the Fitzgerald wants to sail. Okay, that sounds so far like I don't know why that didn't happen, but okay. In 2012, a sibling of the Fitzgerald, the destroyer USS Porter, was in a congested, high-traffic seaway called, they say it like we've never heard of it, the Strait of Hormuz, the ribbon of water that connects the Persian Gulf with the Arabian Sea, when it collided with an oil tanker, which is mostly what you'll collide with if you're going to collide with something in the Strait of Hormuz, I guess. It's funny. I wonder, now it makes me wonder, like, how old is the reporter? Or, they may be just thinking, how old is my audience? I need to tell you where the Strait of Hormuz is. And I guess not everybody does know. I guess you had to come of age at a certain time or be of age at a certain time. Strait of Hormuz, famous to me because I was, I guess college age during the operation during which the United States was reflagging Kuwaiti tankers, oil tankers. Do you remember this? In order to help them navigate the straits and not fall victim to those who would attempt to prevent their shipping of oil to the west. And the Strait of Hormuz, if I recall correctly, you can fall victim to 2 or 3 different powers who might be interested in choking off oil flow. Iran and Iraq, both meet down at that area. Let's take a look at it on the maps here, and zoom out a little bit here too. But it's a very narrow point at the edge of the border, the boundary between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, which would, of course, you'd think that I guess Oman could control those straits as well, although they really don't. They control the wider opening, perhaps, or at least one half of the wider opening to the Gulf of Oman. But Iraq is up at the top, as it happens, up the top of the Persian Gulf. This is down at the bottom. So it's really, Iran was the serious issue with respect to control or closing off of the Strait of Hormuz. And as I recall, they had gotten Chinese missiles at the time that they had just parked on the other side of the strait. The other land end of the strait is what? Who's out there at the end? One of the United Arab Emirates, I guess. And I guess depending on, if you see the map, you can see there are a couple different choke points. But the Iranians were able to use relatively cheap Chinese, what were they called? Silkworm missiles, I think. And they could take out oil tankers on their way to anywhere, really, coming out of the Persian Gulf. And the United States was reflagging Kuwait. Was it Kuwaiti tankers that we were doing? I think so. But pretty much anybody's tankers, and escorting the rest of them through so that the Iranians wouldn't choke off the oil supply. This would be the late 80s. And, I mean, the Strait of Hormuz has come up a number of times. I feel like you don't really need to tell us, that it's at least Persian Gulf related. Although I guess I needed a reminder that it's at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, and Kuwait and Iraq are up at the top. Although, what's the strait or the waterway? Oh, Shat al-Arab. That's the one I'm thinking of. The Iraqis and Iranians are constantly fighting over, and they have different names for it too, because one side of the conflict is Arab, and they'll call it Shat al-Arab, and the other side is Persian, and they'll have a different name for it. But that's a different waterway up at the other end of the Persian Gulf. Anyway, I don't know. I'm just that's a sidetrack. I was just sort of fascinated by the fact that we have to re-explain at least what body of water the Strait of Hormuz is connected to. But okay. Anyway, sailors on the Fitzgerald Combat Information Center are, of course, responsible for tracking what's going on with their boat and what's going on ahead. In 2012, there was this problem with the USS Porter in the Strait of Hormuz, which they describe as the ribbon of water that connects the Persian Gulf with the Arabian Sea, although it's really the Gulf of Oman, but okay. When it collided with an oil tanker, the Navy's investigation, to get back on track here, later found that as sailors tried to keep track of the traffic all around them, including those ships headed in the other direction, they lost focus on their own immediate course ahead. That seems like amazing that could happen. But I guess if you're tracking everything in the region, you could lose sight of something. It just really, honestly, it can't be what's ahead of you. There's no, my wife's new car beeps when you're backing up, and there's a car either passing behind you or approaching from either side. And sometimes when the thing goes off, we can't find the car visually. And only a few seconds later, of course, it shows up. But we don't have something that just says, just in case you lose track of what's immediately in front of you, we'll beep at you about there. But I guess it's too late to turn. Big ships, etc. Still, amazing. When the tanker, what is the name of the tanker of that hit the Porter here? Otawasan. I don't know how you would pronounce it. Otowasan. Otawasan. I don't know. When this tanker suddenly loomed ahead, Commander Martin, how would you pronounce this? Ariola, which I imagine he had some trouble with when he was in school. Arriola, by the way, ordered the Porter to turn left to cross ahead of the huge other ship to avoid a head-on crash, but he hadn't done so with enough time. These boats are large, and not even ordering full speed at the last minute could get the destroyer safely clear. The tanker hit the Porter along its right, or starboard, side, in a location on the ship very near where the ACX Crystal hit the Fitzgerald early Saturday. It seems like we have a problem with that section of the ship, eh? But when the sun came up and the photos appeared of both ships, they revealed the Crystal had damage on the left, or port side, of its bow, suggesting it might have been traveling in the same direction as the Fitzgerald. It may have been trailing the smaller destroyer at a perpendicular angle that stayed relatively the same even as the distance between the ships closed. Constant bearing, decreasing range. I'm confused already, but okay. I guess I wouldn't be able to prevent a collision of ships. If the crew of the Fitzgerald was watching what was ahead of them and got used to the presence of the container ship on their starboard quarter because it didn't appear to be moving in either direction relative to the destroyer, even though it was getting closer all the while, the sailors might not have realized what was happening until they were in extremis. Another similar possibility, the Fitzgerald wanted to sail east, say, and its course crossed over that of the Crystal, heading north. The destroyer might have been like someone trying to get across a busy street, thinking it could get out of the way of oncoming cars in time, and in this case, a miscalculation. Investigators will see this. I guess we watch too many movies where they're able to track either incoming missiles or torpedoes or another ship, and if you're tracking it correctly, I guess if you're really concentrating on that particular object, you can get it right. But, from the movies, they're down to the second, how many seconds to impact and what's the bearing, what's the range. They always know these things, but I guess in this case, not. Investigators will focus closely on what the crews on both ships were doing when the fast attack submarine USS Hartford collided with the amphibious transport USS New Orleans in 2009. Discipline on the sub was lax, the Navy later found. Not something good. I mean, it's a fast attack submarine. Get faster. You would be able to get out of the way of this collision, but your discipline is too lax, I guess. I don't really even know what that's supposed to mean. The Hartford's captain never came into the control room during the transit through the crowded Strait of Hormuz. The navigator was in the wardroom listening to his iPod. Still, it's possible that no one was on the bridge of the Crystal. Even huge container ships are comparatively lightly crewed compared with Navy ships, and unlike warships, often use an autopilot. That's, I guess, also amazing to me. In the wide open Pacific, mariners sometimes let Iron Mike take the helm. I guess, is that what they call their autopilots out there and in the Merchant Marine? After a series of accidents, the U.S. Coast Guard warned mariners last year about the dangers involved with relying too heavily on autopilot. I can't believe we're not still at the stage, we still don't say, yeah, okay, autopilot and all that, but honestly, one guy can't be up in the bridge looking. They really have container ships sailing across the ocean with nobody on the bridge. Whew. The Fitzgerald's bridge was almost certainly crewed by sailors and officers on the overnight mid-watch, and those are the watchstanders who may have made the critical decisions about what to do or not do before the collision. Were they managing a whole screen full of contacts and too distracted to notice the one bearing down on them? Or was it a quiet night with so little to do that the crew became bored and complacent? Investigators will conduct interviews, review navigational data, and could even listen to recordings of what happened on the bridge, like the one eventually released from the Porter. One detail already is known. The Fitzgerald's commanding officer, Commander Bryce Benson, was in his cabin at the time of the accident, 7th Fleet's O'Coin said. The captain's compartment is located on the starboard side of the ship that was crushed by the Crystal, and Benson was hurt. The Japanese Coast Guard took him to shore by helicopter. Other sailors were berthed in compartments farther below decks, which were flooded by the Crystal's bulbous bow. In all, 2 berthing compartments and 1 machinery space, which houses one of the gas turbines for making the ship's electrical power, quickly filled with seawater. Heroic efforts prevented the flooding from catastrophically spreading, which could have caused the ship to founder or sink, O'Coin said. It could have been much worse. The Fitzgerald limped into Tokyo under its own power. The crew of the multi-mission Aegis combatant used a magnetic compass and their backup instruments to get home with only one of the ship's 2 propellers. That's interesting, of course, but yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of this. I mean, with all the sophisticated equipment on board, I know a lot of it was damaged. People are going to have compasses on the boat. I'm not terribly impressed with that necessarily, but it sounds like the more amazing thing, of course, was the people who were able to seal off the various compartments to prevent the ship from sinking. But wow. The destroyer now needs millions of dollars worth of repairs, including a visit to a dry dock before it could be ready to take on another mission. The Navy identified the 7 sailors who died in the accident on Sunday evening. Acting Navy Secretary Sean Stackley, and again, might as well point this out. I mean, it's not overtly or overly political to point this out. We have an acting Navy Secretary. Normally, by this point, you would, of course, have a regular Navy Secretary. But Donald Trump hasn't appointed anyone to anything. So the acting secretary vowed that service officials would answer the question everyone is now asking, how could it have happened? And you know what? Honestly, having read this article, I still don't know. So maybe nobody knows at this point. In due time, the United States Navy will fully investigate the cause of this tragedy, he said, and I ask all of you to keep the Fitzgerald families in your thoughts and prayers as we begin the task of answering the many questions before us. And we better start again because I'm still not clear. Well, what can you do? Another misleading headline. Somebody thought they could explain this, but they've done no better. Again, if you take a look at this destroyer, now mostly destroyed itself, yeah, there are guns on it. You can see that, but the most prominent feature, honestly, the guns are a minor feature on this thing. The most prominent feature appears to be various kinds of radar sensors, and they may be looking at space instead of the water in front of them, but it's still astonishing and still unexplained to me exactly how I mean, you can come up with a scenario. Well, and that's not much of an explanation there either, by the way. How could this have happened? How could a container ship and a sophisticated radar-capable, radar-enhanced destroyer Navy warship, how could they just collide? And basically, if I understand correctly here, the theory is maybe no one was steering either boat. Oh. Well, that would be one answer. Maybe they didn't see the other guys and they sailed right into them. I don't know what to tell you. Of course, the collision's no laughing matter. It's just the explanation or the attempt at giving an explanation. I mean, you're really just better off saying, you know what, at this point, it's just unclear and we're going to have to wait for a Navy report on this one. As I feel poorly served by this NPR article. Did any of the rest of you get anything out of that? I don't know. I better move on. This is not answering any questions. All right. What have we got to explore here? There were other stories over the weekend, by the way, of course. I guess we'd have to make some mention. Greg, of course, brought up the story of the heightened tensions in Syria. That's not going to help things very much, obviously. And then we had 2 somewhat localized stories to talk about. Another incident in London, in which, let me grab this one from CNN. Finsbury Park is, I guess, the section that they're talking about, and the name by which this particular attack is being called. And this is a CNN piece here. Theresa May condemns sickening attack on Finsbury Park Muslims. Another car ramming into people. A man died and 10 people were injured after a van was rammed into a crowd of worshippers near a mosque in North London. The latest terror attack to hit the UK this year, and I guess it's, it was good of them. I mean, they really had no choice but to label it as a terrorist attack if it's an intentional attack on Muslims. I know that sometimes the media is slow to do this, believe it or not, but in this time, I guess, not so much the case. Eyewitnesses reported chaotic scenes as the incident unfolded just after midnight when evening Ramadan prayers had finished. A 48-year-old white man was wrestled to the ground by members of the public and then arrested at the scene on suspicion of attempted murder, authorities said. British Prime Minister Theresa May, of course, on the bubble herself there, said the attack was directed at Muslims and condemned it as every bit as sickening as deadly Islamist attacks, as they put it, that hit the country in recent months. Certainly true. Other interesting developments there. One of the imams from the local mosque stopped the crowd from attacking the attacker as well, and protected him, I guess, until he could be arrested. Very interesting to see that happening. Very easy to imagine that not happening and having the crowd severely injure or even kill the suspected attacker, even though their suspicions would have been confirmed by him coming out of the van that they just witnessed plowing into people. So, but still, not the way we do things. Well, it wouldn't be the way we do things in this country, but of course it didn't happen in this country. What did happen in this country, relatedly over the weekend, in my own area, as a matter of fact, and this one also still largely unclear exactly what happened here, but a teenager, 17-year-old girl in Virginia, right again in my area here, again leaving Ramadan services at night and walking apparently with a group of friends to get something to eat afterwards, walking along the street on the sidewalk, and somebody just pulled up and began assaulting them. Apparently they got a guy drove by and jumped out and, according to various reports, attacked them possibly with a baseball bat and was able to knock one girl to the ground, and the rest of them ran for it, and he killed her. Her body turned up in a local pond just hours later, and it's insane. And they're still trying to figure out, was this a targeted thing? They got no reason to believe it was personally targeted, but it's clear that they were, they were all in their hijab, and it was clear that they were Muslim. They were easily identifiable as such. The police have a suspect in custody. It just doesn't, I don't know. It appears like it has all the makings of a intentional hate crime, but I guess they got to sort these things out. If they can't figure out how two boats collide in the middle of the ocean, this is going to take even longer to figure out the motivations here. And they may never get to the bottom of it. I don't know, but it's really rather astounding and sad. And it's not the first time that this kind of thing has happened. It's the first time I think I've seen it around here, but it's always the first time in a certain neighborhood. It's just that, we have to pay attention to the fact that it's a national trend, just as we do with, it's the whole point of gun fail. Every area eventually has one localized tragedy with a toddler finding a loaded gun and killing themselves or someone else. And it passes because you don't hear about that happening in the same area repeatedly over and over again, but as on a national level is where it makes a difference. But I just wanted to at least note that had taken place and see if there are any further developments in the next couple of days that warrant continued monitoring of the story. But right now it's just sort of one data point in an ongoing series of stories. Others, there are other stories, of course, out there that require our attention, and there's a bunch of them, and I don't even know where to start today. But I never know, really. There's just too many things happening to know where to go with them. Let's see. How about if we jump to, I guess, some of the weekend Trump-Russia investigation developments? And there's been a couple. Oh, and by the way, I want to note also for the record that one of the stories that we noted at the end of last week that continued into the weekend, the continuing Republican outrage over the Trump-themed production of Julius Caesar by the Shakespeare in the Park Theater Company. And lots of examples have come to our attention over the last couple of days of previous productions of Julius Caesar that were similarly themed, either other modern day leaders like, as it turns out, Mussolini, not Hitler, from the Orson Welles production, but also, I think we mentioned even last week that the standard go-to line for Republicans in a situation like this is, of course, imagine the outrage from liberals. Had there ever been a production of Julius Caesar staged in which it appeared that the person assassinated in the play was Barack Obama? And of course, we found out there were such productions, and there was no outrage. It may have been that there was a lack of outrage, perhaps because, I guess you'd like to think it was because liberals are more open-minded and they understand that modern adaptations of Shakespeare happen all the time, and that would be great if that were the case. Another possibility, of course, is that it wasn't in Central Park in New York City where it was produced, although I don't know that it wasn't produced that way in Central Park in New York City. But the examples are from, theaters that probably get far less national media attention than one in Central Park in New York City. But still, no outrage. Also, somebody else noted along the way, by the way, the previous productions that were themed with the Obama administration were not only funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, but also produced. No outrage against the theater, against the endowment, or even worse, as we're finding out now, generalized outrage over Shakespeare. Apparently, leave it to the conservatives on this one. Shakespeare theaters, or even theaters that have the name Shakespeare in them, but don't have anything to do necessarily with, don't necessarily do a Shakespeare repertoire or anything like that. I don't know. Anyway, if your theater has the name Shakespeare in any way associated with it, you likely got threatening calls from conservatives angered about this production by one particular company in New York City. And apparently they think Shakespeare, like Frederick Douglass, is still alive and he hates Donald Trump. And we got to do everything we can to wipe out Shakespeare. Pretty soon we'll be burning Shakespeare books and banning it from the curriculum in Texas, no doubt. And that will lead to the banning of Shakespeare for all around the country because Texas controls all our textbooks somehow. And in addition, they apparently have no idea that the play, people who are more expert or claim to be more expert in Shakespearean drama than I am say that it's worth reminding everybody that the point of the play is, in fact, that the assassination is a terrible turn of events and it ends up doing more harm than good, and it's so rare that assassinations do particular good. But the point of the fuller point of the play is that that's a horrible, reprehensible act and ought not to be contemplated. So if you stay and watch the whole thing, you would know what that. But of course, nobody stays and watches the whole thing. Most of the people complaining didn't watch it. I've never seen it produced. I don't even really necessarily have a great recollection of Julius Caesar. I think we read it like in 10th grade or something. But of course, that took all the fun out of it, and we didn't know what the hell was going on. We were kids, and who knows what point I may have taken away from reading Julius Caesar in 10th grade. Justice says Richard III routinely depicts Hitler as the titular head. It's always fun to be able to say titular this early in the morning. Thanks, Justice. Appreciate that. Hey, Richard III. Richard III, such a misunderstood figure, Richard III. We've seen such interesting, sympathetic portrayals of Richard III of late. People are actually trying to rehabilitate the image of Richard III, and it makes a lot of sense too. Maybe it's a fake news story. You can contemplate it in that context. That, of course, Shakespeare, having written during the Elizabethan era, is heavily invested in the Tudor dynasty, or dynasty, as he might have said, and then through no particular magic, let's say, the entirety of his historical plays, his English historical plays, depict a very, a history that is very favorable to the Tudors. The War of the Roses, and his treatment of, well, Richard III, of course, killed by Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII, and it would have been difficult to imagine in those days a Shakespeare who gets away with the public production and performance of plays that don't depict Richard III as a twisted, conniving mutant who murders the princes in the tower and who usurps the throne and is finally slain, monster that he is, by the founding patriarch of the Tudor dynasty. So I've mixed the American and English pronunciations on that one, just to blend our cultures a little bit. But yeah, you wouldn't have been able to get away with that now. Now in modern times, they're questioning the Shakespeare-tinged legacy of Richard III. I find that's very interesting. The modern productions, the dramas, the teledramas that we can see on the TV these days, the White Queen, the White Princess, they take a very different tack on Richard III. Very interesting to think about the possibility they may have gotten a bad rap. But it's a little too late to rehabilitate the guy at this stage. Sorry about that. He's dead, but they did think they discovered his bones and they moved him to a better burial spot than underneath the parking lot. You remember that story? I did spend some time on that one. All right, where do we go with the rest of what's up here? We got a CNN piece, which I guess will follow up with this very interesting Quora piece as well. CNN reported over the weekend, I think, and this may have been late Friday for us, after the show. House Russia investigators want to bring in Trump digital director. Just a little bit more dot connecting for us. You remember Brad Parscale, and we never did learn how to pronounce his name. He's the focus here in this one. The House Russia investigators are planning to call on Brad Parscale, the digital director of President Donald Trump's campaign, as the congressional and federal probes dig into any possible connections between the Trump digital operation and Russian operatives, congressional sources said this week. This still seems like the richest possible vein for anything approaching direct collusion between the campaign and Russia in my untrained view. It just seems like the sort of thing where the coincidences are otherwise too strong, and it might in fact be that if there's anything really resembling collusion, it might not necessarily be between Donald Trump, the natural person, and anyone from Russia. But, I don't have much doubt that he was likely aware of other cooperation that others were pulling off. They just thought it was okay because, they produced a unique team of people who had no particular professional experience with the very few ethical standards which exist in political operations, because Donald Trump hadn't been a politician. Brad Parscale had made a point in saying when he was under consideration to run the digital operation for the campaign that he had no political experience, but a dangerous combination of people who had never bumped into the norms and ethical standards applicable to this kind of situation, and, of course, very rich people who believe that no standards whatsoever apply to them ever because they're rich, and then, of course, megalomaniacs who, couldn't care less if there are such things as ethical standards. They just, not only do they not apply to him, but that he has some sort of duty to flout them. This seems to be what's going on in his head. Anyway. In his head. The House Russia investigation now planning to send an invite to Parscale soon. It wouldn't, I guess, necessarily rise to subpoena level just yet. As they begin scheduling witnesses over the summer, sources said, the Senate Intelligence Committee also interested in how Russian bots were able to target political messages in specific districts and critical swing states, although it's not clear if Parscale will be called before the Senate panel as well. The news from the House comes as federal investigators have dug into Jared Kushner's role overseeing Trump's data operation. They're buying into the story that he was the digital genius behind it all, which, if true, fantastic. I'm glad they're digging into it. If not true, then I hope we'll find out that he's actually not that smart. I don't really know which one it is, but I'd like to get to the bottom of it myself. But it would be hilarious if it was just something he was claiming because he thought he could get away with it, and it instead got him in huge amounts of trouble. But okay. Anyway, though Kushner has not been identified as a target of the probe at this point, Kushner is expected to talk soon with Senate investigators, I don't know who actually expects that, about the campaign's data operation. Pascal played a critical role behind the scenes on the Trump campaign, directing online spending and voter targeting with the use of a highly sophisticated data bank built by the Republican National Committee. Pascal was running the Trump organization's digital operation in early 2015 when he was hired onto the Trump campaign months before Trump officially announced his bid. Pascal told CNN Friday that he had not been contacted by any investigators, either federal or congressional. Senate investigators in particular have been interested in looking for a link between the prevalence of fake news that supported Trump and was pinpointed in key areas of Rust Belt states that ultimately flipped from blue to red and helped Trump secure the White House. There have been reports that their ability to target this information, some reports at least saying that in the last week of the campaign, in certain precincts in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, there was so much misinformation coming, talking about Hillary Clinton's illnesses or Hillary Clinton stealing money from the State Department or other garbage, essentially. It completely blanked out any of the back and forth that was actually going on in the campaign. Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, said at a March 30th hearing. By the way, it does open up interesting possibilities, right, as we're considering the nature of the strategic fight over the health care bill that the Republicans are trying to put forward, the tax cut bill, or if we think back to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, and lots of complaints about there just not being enough outreach and targeting and discussion and defense of the Affordable Care Act from Democrats then or now. And perhaps there's something to be learned from this digital operation after all. If it was able to really pull off what they claim, then how interesting would it be if it had been within our reach all along to have reached the Rust Belt and told them the story of the Affordable Care Act and gotten them on board with these things? Well, that would be worth considering. But I guess we got to take this apart first and figure out whether it really happened. Warner added, one of the things that seems curious is, would the Russians on their own have that level of sophisticated knowledge about the American political system if they didn't at least get some advice from someone in America? Clint Watts, a former FBI agent and counterterrorism expert, responded that Russian bots masqueraded as conservative voters to support Trump, but did not say whether he believed the Russians had any help from American political operatives in picking out their targets. Part of the reason those bios had conservative Christian, America and all those terms in it, is that those are the most common ones. If you inhale all the accounts of people in Wisconsin, you identify the most common terms in it. You just recreate accounts that look exactly like people from Wisconsin, Watts testified. So that way, whenever you're trying to socially engineer them and convince them that the information is true, it's much more simple because you see somebody and they look exactly like you, even down to the pictures. When you look at the pictures, it looks like an American from the Midwest or the South or Wisconsin or whatever the location is, and they will change those. They can reprogram them. That's true, and that's one of the more interesting aspects of all of this. But Pascal dismissed the idea that online bots controlled by Russian operatives would have been effective in swinging votes to Trump, noting that Twitter, where those bots operate, was not an effective tool for the campaign itself, albeit a highly effective tool for Trump. Twitter, Pascal said, is designed for shouting a message to extremes on the left and right, but Facebook is where influencers can be most effective in moving key swing votes. I don't differentiate between them all that much because I think, for the most part, we find that the sophisticated bot operations, the bots operate on Twitter for the purpose of driving people to Facebook pages, so it doesn't really make that much sense to separate them that way. Twitter wasn't even something we focused on in the campaign. We didn't feel it mattered. Facebook is where 70% of voters focused and was the 500-pound gorilla to win the election, Pascal said. Twitter is not where Trump voters were. Over 95% of the campaign's online budget went to Facebook. Okay, so I don't think that contradicts too much. But there's this other piece I mentioned here. Let's click back through it. A Quora piece, which means we are reading. Is this the piece we were looking for? We're reading not a journalistic outlet like the New York Times, not a traditional media piece, but rather the writings of, what it comes down to is random people on the internet. So you always have to kind of take this with a grain of salt. But I think this was an interesting thought that we'll inject into things and try and consider critically. But anyway, the Quora places where you pose questions and people who purport to have some particular expertise in those kinds of questions will post their answers for community review, and sometimes you get good ones, sometimes you get crazy ones. The question that was posed here was, what advertising agency did Donald Trump use for his presidential campaign? And the answer that was intriguing here comes from someone named Archie DeCruz, D''Cruz, who says he works in advertising and has written and contributed articles on HuffPost and Inc., I-N-C, like Incorporated, the magazine. So as I'm sure on a freelance basis, not as a staffer there. But let's see. We have this answer from him. He says, there's an interesting story to this one. And what was to prove a masterstroke, Donald Trump picked Giles, I don't know whether it was Giles or Giles, Giles, Pascal, a little-known San Antonio, Texas agency that had never previously worked on a political campaign, as we noted. Co-founder Brad Pascal, who was appointed digital director, was known to Trump long before the billionaire entered the race. He had previously built a number of small websites for the Trump Organization. I think we'd heard that. But he would play a far more crucial and possibly even defining role in the billionaire's election victory. Pascal was drawn into the operation by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Ivanka's husband, it says here, that's funny, who by all accounts was the campaign mastermind. I wonder whether that's something he either made up or wishes to duck now at this point. I'm really not sure how I feel about that one. A third key role was played by a small British data science firm, you know it already, Cambridge Analytica. Together they helped Trump pull off the biggest political upset in U.S. history. This is a story of a completely unconventional campaign using unconventional strategies. It even had an unconventional end game in mind where an election defeat would still translate into a win. That's an interesting point to make, and I think all along they sort of anticipated losing, and this does go on to explain a little bit about why a political loss could be a win anyway. And when we get to that, keep in mind, I think it's very interesting, when they, particularly when they're describing the role of Jared Kushner and these huge risks that he bet big on digital. He shied away from traditional media for his advertising dollars, and they spent big on digital, and it was a risk, and no one knew if it would work, but it paid off, and he's a genius. That is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is, if you think you win even by losing, does that put taking gigantic and unconventional risks in a different light? If you are yourself the scion of a family that's come to billionaire status, even though it's highly questionable how much of that is debt-based, and is he really a billionaire? And you're married to Ivanka Trump, whose dad also likewise questionable as a billionaire, but appears to have lots of the ability to move lots of cash. Let's say you're enormously wealthy. Your father-in-law is enormously wealthy. Your wife is enormously wealthy. And you're running the campaign of a guy who thinks that a loss is a win, right? And conventional means appear by most accounts, not to offer you any legitimate path to victory. What do you do? Well, I guess at that point, and if you're a big believer in digital advertising and micro-targeting, you say, and you or someone you are closely associated with have an enormous financial stake in boosting the prospects of a digital targeting, micro-targeting firm, what do? You say, to hell with it. Let's take this enormous risk because even if we lose, we win. And it's not particularly brave. It would have been a particularly brave thing for Hillary Clinton to say, I'm going to abandon all traditional campaign methodology and risk it all on this other approach that will, as it happens, turns out to pay off enormously, and everybody thinks you're a genius for heading in that direction. It's if you care about losing that the real genius part of it, I think, emerges. But anyway. From a purely marketing viewpoint, our writer here says, this to me ranks as one of the 3 standout path-breaking campaigns executed by a victorious candidate in the modern era. The first was John F. Kennedy, who recognized the power of television and harnessed it to great effect in a very tight race in 1960. The second was Barack Obama, who in 2008 wrote the book on social networking to spearhead the then best-financed political campaign in history. And then there was Donald J. Trump. So what made the 2016 Trump campaign different? Donald Trump was losing the battle on a number of fronts. By conventional wisdom, should have condemned him to the worst defeat in U.S. election history. And that would have been sweet. I would have preferred that, I think. He was taking an absolute battering in the mainstream media. His available funds were nowhere close to that for Hillary Clinton. So $322 million in campaign funding compared to $703 million for Clinton. His polling numbers were a mess, a total mess. I love the mess reference there. His polling numbers were a mess even the day prior to the election. The New York Times gave him only a 15% chance of victory. I think we all remember that. After stagnating near 10% in August. But there were 2 elements to Trump's campaign that were to prove invaluable to his eventual success, if you can call it that. The first was earned media. That meaning free publicity through television and newspaper coverage and social media mentions. By one estimate, Trump pulled in some $5 billion in earned media. By way of comparison, Clinton had $3.25 billion in free publicity, and Obama in 2012 had done about $1.15 billion, it was estimated. Much of the publicity that Trump attracted was negative, and it was assumed that this was a bad thing. And as it turns out, that was wrong. You know the old adage about any publicity being good publicity as long as they spell your name right. And you know what? Even if they misspelled Trump, it didn't matter much. Hard to do, but whatever. The reason Trump dominated news cycles was because of the outrageous statements he made. Calling Mexicans rapists, claiming Muslims celebrated when the World Trade Center came down, calling for a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, supporting torture as a means of extracting information from prisoners, offering only lukewarm rejection of white supremacist David Duke's endorsement, etc. Presidential candidates have historically preferred to be careful with their statements for fear of alienating potential voters. Not Trump. He embraced controversy, and when faced with widespread condemnation, he chose to retaliate rather than back down. And that all does sound rather familiar. Let's see. I have a note here from Armando looking to weigh in on a court case that I have not has not entered my radar just yet. But let's I can get through this explanation, I think, rather quickly, and we can move on and speak to Armando in just a minute and get another piece of news you may have missed. I did. Anyway, presidential candidates have historically, of course, preferred to be careful with their statements. Not Trump. He embraced controversy. By going where he did, Trump may well have repulsed a lot of voters, but what he also did was connect on a deeper level with people who shared the same views as him, views that they could not readily express for fear of being called racists or worse, like deplorable, right? Views they likely would not share with pollsters, but views they would signal agreement with in one poll that mattered the most on Election Day. So next section here called Project Alamo. What's this all about? While controversies ensured Trump dominated the headlines on the election trail, there was another silent campaign underway. which few were aware of. It was led by Kushner, who began taking on an increasingly larger role once it became clear that Trump would secure the Republican nomination. Kushner, who is well connected in Silicon Valley, he and Peter Thiel are co-investors in a real estate online marketplace called Kagro. He believed that new tools in social media and technology, the new tools that they offered, could make the difference as they attempted to neutralize Hillary Clinton's funding advantage. Rather than splurge on national advertising like the Clinton team was doing, Kushner opted to limit TV commercials and instead gambled big on digital. And again, I would say it's not really that much of a gamble if you don't care whether you win or lose. Far from the blinding spotlights that engulfed Trump Tower in New York, Kushner began assembling a team in San Antonio. He put Pascal in charge of the digital operation. Most of the team had never worked on a political campaign, but they were skilled in what mattered: research, digital marketing, building statistical models, and scaling strategies that were shown to work. And then, in the summer, the campaign added the final important piece to the puzzle. Oh, the important piece is finally getting here. All right, let me add Armando to the mix here just for a second. Hey, Armando, how you doing?
Oh, hold on a second.
Okay. Oh, I see. All right. Well, we'll hold, and I guess you'll call back in again. Let me continue with this here. No, I won't even get the chance to do that. Okay, there you are. Hi. You with us? You got your audio working?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I think I pressed the wrong button.
That's all right. Hang on for just a second here. Let me see what we've got left to this. Let me plow through this.
Finish. I just need 15 minutes.
Sure.
And it's a personal indulgence that David is being very kind to let me get out of my system.
All right. Well, let's go on here then. We were just talking about, I was talking about the framing of Jared Kushner's decision to concentrate heavily on online targeting and digital media as such a big gamble. But again, I'm not a big believer in labeling it a huge gamble. If they really went into it thinking it really doesn't matter whether we win or lose, we have exit plans for both. Actually, it would be better if we lost. That they had a plan for. Winning, they did not. So but if it doesn't matter to you personally because you're a billionaire and so is your father-in-law and you have plans for what to do once you get crushed at the polls, hell, I'd gamble, quote-unquote gamble, on digital media also, especially if I owned or friends of mine owned significant interests in the businesses that get paid for doing that kind of digital targeting. He was lining his own pockets. Not really a huge gamble. It's actually the opposite of a gamble. Anyway, most of the team had never worked on a political campaign, but they were skilled in the digital marketing and targeting. And in the summer, they added this important final piece to the puzzle, micro-targeting. This would be the second ingredient that proved to be the difference maker in the 2016 election, according to our writer here. In mid-August, Trump put out this cryptic tweet, which said on August 18th, "They will soon be calling me Mr. Brexit," which probably confused a bunch of us in August, but I don't know. No one quite got what he was referring to. It would only be much later that it would emerge that the campaign had signed on Cambridge Analytica, which had worked on the Leave side of the Brexit initiative for the UK to quit the European Union. The London data science firm was brought on their side, onto the Trump side by incoming Trump campaign CEO Steve Bannon, who sits on the Cambridge Analytica board. While the use of big data in election campaigns isn't new, even Obama used it to a degree in 2012, Cambridge Analytica, at least claims anyway, to take it a step further, it extracts every single bit of information it can find on an individual, up to 5,000 data points, including social media likes, voter registration records, shopping patterns, and gun ownership. It then builds what it calls a psychographic profile, which attempts to map personality based on the OCEAN criteria: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, it's not even a word, and neuroticism. The campaign used the data to build a geolocation tool, plotting the density of persuadable voters, according to their calculations, what would make a persuadable voter anyway, in swing states, and superimposing that basically over a Google Maps interface. This was at the heart of every key decision, from where to advertise to where to locate their rallies, even the topics that Trump should bring up in his speeches. It'd be interesting, right? If you got geolocated information that says, all right, we've decided there's a certain density of likely Trump persuadables here. That's why we're having our rally in this particular, let's say, backwater, which would otherwise be inexplicable. And for some reason, everybody in that area is talking, of everyone who fits our profile, is talking about X issue, even if it doesn't make any sense. They'll tell Trump people want to hear about that issue, and he'll happily indulge them when he gets there. Interesting. So there was apparently a method to the madness when it came to Trump's podium rants. They would have him bring up these dumb local issues in his speeches, which, after all politics being local, that's pretty traditional, actually. The campaign also micro-targeted Facebook ads, each one tailored to groups of like-minded people. Ads were tested relentlessly. This is one of the things you can do with super cheap data processing capacity. There were some 40,000 to 50,000 variants of online ads put out every day to see which ones users engaged with. Ads that scored poorly were killed within minutes. Those that generated a response were quickly scaled to larger audiences. It was, as one team member puts it, A/B testing on steroids. In the closing stretch, it's typical for campaigns to launch get-out-the-vote drives, of course, to increase turnout of likely supporters. Unfortunately for Trump, neither he nor the Republican National Committee had prioritized the registration and mobilization of what polls showed to be his biggest base, eligible white voters without college degrees. To compensate for this, Pascal's team rolled out a suppress the vote campaign instead, targeting 3 specific groups of likely Clinton supporters: young women, African Americans, and idealistic white liberals. Negative ads like the 20-year-old clip where she suggested some African Americans were super predators were rolled out in a bid to turn them off Clinton and make them too disillusioned to vote at all. Much of this flew under the radar, even while most polls had given up Trump for dead. Pascal claimed in an interview with Fox that on the Friday before the election, he had predicted the Republican candidate would win with 305 electoral votes. As it turned out, he was off by just 1. For all their stated confidence, there was no guarantee that the Trump campaign team's numbers would stand up after the vote count. In fact, it appears both Trump and Kushner had been preparing for that likelihood. The backup plan was to capitalize on what they had built through Project Alamo. The database had captured information on millions of Trump supporters, including email addresses and phone numbers. Had he lost, he would have used it to build an audience for a Trump TV network. Remember when that was in the offing? That's, of course, fallen by the wayside because he's supposed to be busy now. He's not, but he's not going to launch the TV network. Anyway, in fact, barely 3 weeks prior to the election, the Financial Times reported that Kushner had approached Lion Tree Advisors, Chief Executive Arya Burkhoff, about the possibility of launching just such a network. The Trump operation was the ultimate win-win setup. Which win Donald Trump would have preferred is anybody's guess. It's an interesting summary of things, and I don't think there was much in the way of new information there, but lots of reminders of old dots that we've connected along the way, and it will be very interesting to see. I don't know if they're going to be able to or even be interested in dragging any more connective tissue by way of information out of Brad Pascal if he does accept the invitation of the House Russia investigators to testify. So far, lots of people are accepting their invitations and simply saying, I'm not going to tell you anything. And because they're not under subpoena, nothing gets done. But I'm sure if we cooperate on the health care bill, all that will change. Let's not even entertain that possibility. We'll talk more about the strategy for how to deal with the health care bill as it draws nearer later in the week. In the meantime, Armando, waiting patiently. Tell me what's on your mind here. You texted me about speaking about a case. I'm not even familiar with it.
There's a case that came down from the Supreme Court, which no one cares about because it's just trademarks. And it just annoys me. So this is absolutely a personal indulgence. I don't think it's going to shake the republic one way or the other.
That's too bad. All right.
But to pique your interest, it's basically the Washington Redskins trademark case.
Ah, okay.
But
I know them.
It was the case before it, and the Supreme Court was smart to depoliticize it by using the case that's more amenable to left support.
Okay.
It's the slants. There's a band called the Slants that tries to reappropriate the racial disparaging term for Asian Americans or Asians generally. Gotcha. Slant-eyed slants. Here's the problem for me.
Okay.
It's just a bad decision, even though it was a unanimous decision, by the way. I am on such a lonely island. I don't think there's 3 people that agree with me on this. But just to give you 2 minutes of background, federal trademark registration is a system. There's an office called the United States Patent and Trademark Office. They register patents, trademarks, slogans, things like that. The existence of a trademark is not dependent on a federal trademark registration. You can use a trademark. You can create rights in it through common law. But we have a system where you can register it. And what does registering confer on you? With certain benefits, a presumption of validity, if there's a dispute about it, a constructive notice to third parties so that if they infringe it, they're presumed to know about it. Are the benefits all that big? In my view, people are overblown about it, but that's fine. I'm more concerned with the case itself, where they said that when the government doesn't register the trademark because, and this has been a long-standing rule of the Trademark Office, for what's called disparagement. The disparagement prohibition. There's other prohibitions, by the way, descriptive, not generic, not unique, things like that I think can be called content restrictions as well, if you want to get technical about it. But they said this is viewpoint discrimination, therefore it violates the First Amendment.
Okay.
And I just disagree.
It violates the First Amendment.
There is no particular viewpoint that is being there's no particular disparaging viewpoint that is being restricted here. All of them are, and the government says, I can't stop you from saying them or using them as a trademark. I just, as a government policy, refuse to register them on our federal register.
All right.
So you can call yourself the Slants all you want. No one's stopping you from calling yourself the Slants or saying the Slants or doing whatever the Slants do. Just like their Washington Redskins. When their federal trademark was denied, they were still called the Washington Redskins. They still sold stuff with Redskins on it.
Yes.
Right? So what is the First Amendment textually says Congress shall pass no law that infringes on speech, right? This doesn't infringe on speech. You get to say exactly the same things you could say before you asked for it to be registered.
Yes,
you're saying you're denied a privilege that the government has created.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'll agree with that.
But it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech. Your speech isn't abridged.
The only thing you can't do is get the government's help with presumptions of your correctness and other people's incorrectness when you sue them for infringing on your trademark. You can even still do that. It's just the government isn't going to come in and help you and say you're the holder of a registered trademark. You have that trademark. We didn't write it down. That's all.
Right. It's just not on the register.
Okay.
That's all. I mean, it simply doesn't, to me, it's not a First Amendment case. This is especially true when you think about it in these terms. To register a trademark, you have to represent to the Trademark Office that the use is in commerce. That is, that it is commercial speech. But the Supreme Court didn't even agree that it was commercial speech. It said it's a requirement of the statute. Of course it's commercial speech. So I just don't get it. And I think it's going to be funny. I think in some ways this case is going to turn out to be like the Jones case, which was also unanimous. Remember the Jones-Clinton case?
Mm-hmm.
No problems here, right?
Yeah.
President has plenty of time for these things. Well, watch and see all the crazy and offensive trademarks that get registered.
Well,
it's going to be a political storm.
I guess.
When you read them. It's going to be crazy.
Possible. You know what it reminds me very much of is, it's almost as if, it's odd that it would be a unanimous decision, and I guess it probably speaks more to one of the other points that you frequently make with the court is that it's pretty political in nature, and both parties, I guess, as they're represented among the justices, would have had reason to vote to, in a way, I don't know. It's just a very strange thing.
Oh, no, this is the one where they show, this is actually political in a different way. This shows how, see, we all can come together.
Yeah.
And we're really a court of law type nonsense.
But a political decision to show everybody that they're not political. Okay.
It is. Yeah. It sounds oxymoronic, but it's exactly what this is.
No one, may be right.
The case shouldn't even been taken. It's just not important enough.
It's totally avoidable on normal grounds that they use all the time to avoid taking cases. It's not a constitutional issue here. I mean, I think I agree with your interpretation of it here. It's not an infringement on free speech, and it feels like the court has been infected by, well, I guess lots of people on both sides eventually come to this mistake, but it's been very frequently made on the so-called conservative, because we don't have a real name for them yet, side of late. I mean, every time Sean Hannity says, the liberals are engaging in fake news and they're violent and they're the ones who are they want to assassinate Trump or whatever it is, and people say that guy's crazy. We're going to talk to his advertisers and say, why are you spending money advertising in support of this guy? And his first reaction is, how dare you infringe on my free speech rights? Why do you hate the Constitution? And everybody has to remind him that's not what it's about. That's not actually the correct interpretation of the First Amendment. It protects you from government action. At least there's some government action here in this case. But the idea being, there's freedom of speech on all sides here. And we're free to talk to your advertisers, and advertisers are free to decide that they don't want their brand tainted with their money. They don't want you ruining the brand using their dollars to do it. And everybody's free to speak on that same issue. And similarly, I agree with your analysis. I'm surprised you haven't been able to find more people who agree. What's the infringement? You can have the copyright, and that's a hugely important point that you bring up, that you have a copyright and can claim a copyright completely independent of whether or not the federal government says, we'll write it down for you. A lot of people don't know that is once you begin using it in commerce, it's considered a trademark. You'll see it in the difference between the way it's noted in writing, right? You'll see when people just put the TM there, that's just them claiming the trademark. And when people put it in put that circled R over it in the superscript, that's a indication that it's a federally registered trademark.
Yeah, it has an imprimatur of government approval.
Yeah. And I mean at least it brings
if
the government
it is
into
speech,
it.
the government shouldn't be involved in it at all. Stop registering trademarks.
I guess
Period.
That's a possibility, but that's really that's a commerce issue, not a speech issue. We're just making it easier for people in this very large market to be able to sue people that if you started the
purpose of trademark
company.
infringement laws, in theory, is to protect consumers from confusion.
Yeah.
But that's really what it is. It's not to make a message about
that's true.
Donald Trump sucks or whatever.
Right.
Look, people are going to be imaginative. There is going to be a rush to the trademark office for all these crazy registrations of complete, disparaging.
We should raise the fee quickly.
Absolutely. There's going to be a nice little chunk of money to come in for these guys. There's going to be thousands of these. And by the way, I get to put them on T-shirts, and I'm the only one that gets to do it.
That's right.
It's nuts, and it's all feel good, and you see all the do-gooders and First Amendment, and it just. So it's such a fundamental misunderstanding. And I hate to say it, too many trademark professionals are agreeing with it. I do some trademark work, fair amount. And I know what trademark disputes are about. they aren't about free expression of political views or things like that. That isn't what it is. It just isn't that.
You wouldn't want
this guy
to
with the slants. I mean, that's the name of his band, so he's using it commercially. Great. I could almost say, fine, but now you're going to have 8,000, which have basically where the commercial use is tangential. And now, all of a sudden, the trademark office is the repository of free expression? Give me a break.
That's going to be interesting. It's going to make people's desk jobs miserable, as you have to sit there and you're now forced to approve and register trademarks for Patent and Trademark Office employees suck brand breakfast cereal.
Listen, Richard Spencer's going to file 27 different trademarks with the N-word in it.
Yeah. Right.
And you're going to have to suck it up now.
All right. Well, that's going to be fun. Maybe they'll revisit this one and
no, they won't, no? Because now they're all happy. They haven't revisited Jones, and everyone's patting them on the back. And no one thinks these things through.
I'm opening a specialty boutique practice specifically for this, and like I said, my firm name, I don't know if you want to join, is the Supreme Court is Full of Jerks. Law firm.
How about that for a trademark?
I'd like to trademark that. I may lose my case in the end, but I think it'll be well worth it. And like I said, my other division, which is Patent and Trademark Office Drones Are A-Holes, is also going to get approved.
Why not?
I can't think of any reason not to.
This is the whole point. That's not what the trademark registry is about, but now it will be.
Well, he's creating jobs.
Now it will be. Well, it's the Supreme Court that's created jobs. This is ivory tower nonsense.
It's going to be very interesting. And with a hiring freeze at Patent and Trademark Office, which will mean that, Frosted Flakes and other legitimate businesses, if you think they're not, call the show. Yeah. But they're not going to be getting their trademarks anytime soon because everybody's going to be trademarking, all sorts of epithets.
Right. I will say there's one other thing, the disparagement law that they passed. It's under dilution, they call it, for famous marks. That's now obviously unconstitutional under this doctrine, because if the trademark itself can be disparaging, obviously I can disparage the trademark, the holder of the trademark. So much for that, in my opinion.
It creates a lot of work.
You got 3 minutes. Thanks for letting me rant about this.
Sure.
Because, no one will ever mention this again until there's 800 Richard Spencer trademarks with the N-word in it.
Yeah, well, we'll be watching those happen.
It's coming.
Trump. I guess so.
You heard it here
first. It's not even his fault. Yes, another instance of our jumping in ahead of the news. Thanks, Armando. That is an interesting twist.
Thanks for letting me vent.
All right, no problem.
Bye-bye.
It's what we do here, and we should register some sort of trademark to note that, and I guess it'll be easier than ever, and I can even make it disparaging or even slightly dirty, or even horribly dirty, I guess. I just can't tell you what it is on the air. I wonder if that'll maybe we can make a FCC case out of this thing. I can't help having said that on the air. The advertiser that bought the spot, that's their trademark, and I had to read it or else we wouldn't get paid. That's a great case. We'll see if we can't make that one happen all by myself. Anyway, things coming up next on the after show. There'll be bat and cleanup as usual, getting to all the really important stories, including the story of anti-choice activist. How does he pronounce his name? This one, David Daladin. Remember him? He's the one who was producing all these smear campaign videotapes against Planned Parenthood, contending that they were selling baby parts, that itself inspired a terrorist attack against Planned Parenthood, by the way. He is looking at perhaps going to jail, along with his lawyers, as I saw it.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Oh, let's see. Looks like we have something going on. Are you having a crash on the Netroots radio side? We'll see what we can bring up for our after show slot after this. Do stay tuned. Lots to discuss. If they don't get a chance to discuss it right after this show, we'll be discussing it for the rest of the week. I am pretty sure of that one. Stay tuned.